Hello and welcome to this video on Philosophy for All. Today we're privileged to be joined by Edmund Weiner, the Deputy Chief Editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, to talk all things about the Oxford English Dictionary. If you're interested in dictionaries, language, and more, this is indeed the interview for you. Thank you so much for coming onto the channel.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So to get started off with dictionaries in general, can you tell us a bit more about what is the purpose and use of a dictionary, especially in a modern age where most people are probably just going on nowadays, ChatGPT probably, if they find a word they don't know and ask the AI, what is this word and what does it mean? What does a dictionary do?
Yes, things are changing a bit rapidly, aren't they, with AI? I suppose when you ask ChatGPT, can't say its name, but it probably is using a dictionary to tell you the answer. So in that sense, there's still a dictionary behind it, and so clearly one of the primary purposes is to tell you what a word you don't know actually means, or perhaps you think you know, but you'd like to use it accurately, and so you'll check that way. A lot of people think that a dictionary is there to prescribe usage and tell you you must use a word this way and you must not use it that way. And that's not the view of most lexicographers. Most of them think that they are describing the language rather than laying down rules. And of course, there are other purposes for a dictionary, which we might talk about further, like checking spelling and, pronunciation and all the other subsidiary uses.
That's quite interesting. And I suppose you touch on the idea of describing language versus prescribing how language should be used. In some sense, the use of a dictionary would suggest it is to prescribe how language is to be used. Yet at the same time, those who are making the dictionaries would seem to be that they're trying to describe how it is being used. Through your interaction with making dictionaries and engaging with this field, how do you find those two, kind of the uses, the function of it, and also the generation of dictionary? How do those interact?
You mean, how does a prescriptive view and a descriptive view interact, or?
Yes, I suppose that's...
Well, I mean, in a kind of superficial way, there's a bit of a tension often between the expectations of users, of some users, let's say, who do think of the dictionary a bit as if it's a Bible. This is the right way to use things. And we do often find ourselves kind of trying to correct that view, although people are rather loath to be corrected. I think that on the other hand, there are an awful lot of users who are aware that of the descriptive function of the dictionary. So I think that's only a kind of perhaps a marginal problem. Sorry, just remind me what the further aspect of your question was. I've lost track.
Yes, I suppose when it comes to, especially, I guess there could be a problem where if it is trying to describe the use of a language, yet at the same time people are purely going to the dictionary to just simply follow what it is, do you end up getting into a bit of a circular loop where I suppose a dictionary is trying to keep up to date with what's going on, when actually what's going on is kind of trying to keep up to date with what the dictionary is doing? Have you ever noticed that happening?
I think the historical angle is really important here, because people who don't think a lot about language probably have a bit of a view that language doesn't change, and they're disconcerted by change. So they often comment in a negative way about new usages, particularly if they come from other parts of the English-speaking world, not to name any. But I think for a lexicographer, it's kind of fundamental that language changes all the time. And that's really why we're in business, because of keeping track of those changes. And of course, that's the most interesting thing about it. Those of us who work on the Oxford English Dictionary specifically, of course, that's our main interest, because it's a historical dictionary which is there to map changes over time. And so I think that's probably where the tension arises, because people just don't realize the extent of change, because it's not quite fast enough you know, in an individual person's lifetime for it to be very obvious, but every now and then something you know, particularly noticeable appears, and that bothers people, and that's when you get that kind of slightly negative response to things.
Can you tell us a bit more about what a lexicographer is and what they may be doing? I suppose a lot of people coming or watching this might be from a philosophy background or have general interests in dictionaries in general, but not have it come across this term.
I think the sort of overall aim is to make a map of a language, to have a complete inventory of what's in it. And to do that, you've got to work from evidence. And up till recently, you had to collect the evidence quite laboriously by simply taking examples out of mostly printed literature. And of course, that's changed now. And again, we could probably talk more about that later on. But in one way or another, you've got to collect evidence and then analyze that evidence in terms of each word and each meaning of a word and each phrase, compound, and so on, and build that up into an overall picture of the language. If you're simply concerned with the current language, you obviously sift out things that you think are obsolete or not very common or not very important for whatever reason, because well, traditionally, of course, you only had a certain number of pages to fill. But even now, you wouldn't necessarily be interested in collecting those. Again, historical dictionary is different because almost everything is grist to our mill. So we will collect really everything in order to get an overall historical picture of English or whichever language we were working on.
That's quite interesting. And I suppose, is there a view in which a dictionary, of course, like the Oxford English Dictionary, talks about English as a whole, as a dictionary for the whole language, but how does one approach the ideas of different subcultures and different uses of a language or a certain word within a language? So, for example, I could think about, I'm not sure whether this is more of a modern phenomenon, but I'm sure it probably is the case quite a while back, where different cultures use words in different ways or with different meanings. I think an example that comes to the top of my mind would be the word mandem in the streets these days. They describe certain people as mandem on the Instagrams or whatever. And I'm like, oh, well, I've never come across this word in a certain fashion. So it seems that particular usage would be different from perhaps the word in a broader general sense. How would you engage with those cases where words are used differently in different parts of the English language with English speaking community?
Yes, you're completely right that is a major consideration, because if you look at lexicography, well, say in English, but it's probably true of other language, historically people would have really been thinking about their language as a standard dialect, what was written, what was used, in print, and you could sort of corral that relatively easily. But of course, what a language really isn't that. That is a very artificial construct. It's a powerful construct. It's an important one, and it's one that it's valid. But the reality is, of course, is that there isn't such a thing as just a language. There's just a huge conglomeration of dialects or sub varieties, whatever you want to call them, and they can be sort of, you can slice it in different ways. You can slice it regionally, clearly, although the regional varieties of, say, English are much less important than they used to be. Let's say in just take Britain. Clearly at one point the dialect map of Britain was highly complex, but that's not really the case so much now. Then you can slice it by, all kinds of subculture. You can slice it by, occupations and trades and specialisms. There's scientific language, which is a huge, it's absolutely enormous, and we can never hope to map all of it. It's actually something that we grapple with, and I think the solutions that you find in a dictionary like the OED are a bit pragmatic. They're not it's almost impossible to sit down and say, this is exactly how we're going to do it. It tends to be a developing picture. For example, World English, as we call it, has become more and more important in the last few decades. And whereas we could probably practically ignore, let's not use the word ignore, because that sounds rather prejudiced. We didn't have to worry about, we didn't have to think about, say, the language spoken in, just to take a random, Southeast Asia, let's say, the form of English that would be used there, because it could be seen as somewhat marginal and somewhat subsidiary to other forms like British or American English. Now, they have to be treated as having existing in their own right. And I wouldn't say we've therefore cracked that problem, or we've covered them, as they deserve. Arguably, of course, each regional variety deserves its own special dictionary, and that's another whole issue. And of course, some regions of English do have their own dictionaries, and others don't. So, as I say, it's very much a fluid, changing picture, and it's not perfect by any means.
And I suppose this raises quite an interesting philosophical question of sorts, and I wonder whether you have any thoughts about this, well, to what extent does the language deviate from English in so much as it is no longer or should not be considered as English? For example, I sometimes go on my Instagram and I scroll through and it comes up football news in Pidgin or something like that. And I go through it and I read through it. I'm like, well, I understand kind of what it's saying. I understand probably 70 or 80% of it, but I'm not sure whether I would say this is English. How far do you think those boundaries are drawn? Whereas if I go through South Asian, a news report, it's pretty much, I would say 99.5% similar. How does that kind of compare with each other?
Yes, again, I mean, there's a historical dimension behind that, isn't there? And that a lot of world Englishes, such as the ones you mentioned, have sort of adopted standard English pretty well, but then, but they are beginning to develop their own usages, and in fact, hidden beneath the surface of the news reports which have been standardized is probably a colloquial variety of, in the same region, which is a lot more different from what, say, British or American standard English than one realizes. But then if you look at the historical picture at greater depth, and you take an area like the Caribbean, you've got forms of, as you say, there are what are technically known usually as creoles, which are, once a pidgin variety of English has become a normal pidgin. Sorry, let's start again. Pidgins are usually used as second languages, as trade languages between groups. But once the children of those groups begin to speak them as their first language, then they're usually called by scholars creoles. It doesn't particularly matter what the term is, but those in say the Caribbean are very different from, as you've just said, they're almost unintelligible compared to standard English. And in fact, in a lot of those areas, you find a kind of spectrum going from an almost unintelligible variety at one end of the spectrum to an almost standard variety at the other, and kind of individual, different layers in between, depending on the individuals and how they use them. So the picture is incredibly complicated. The more you look, the more you sort of focus in, the more granular it becomes, and the less some sort of platonic idea of the English language, or whichever, nation you want to connect it with, the more it becomes a sort of, an almost an unreal construct.
That's quite fascinating, and we've touched on this Oxford English Dictionary quite a lot, and we've also talked about the English language. So let's move on slightly to the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary. Can you tell us a bit about the historical circumstances which led people to realize, oh, hold on a second, it would be quite nice if we had something like the Oxford English Dictionary? How did this come about?
Yes, at the end of probably the time to talk about is the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in Britain. People were aware that they had this wonderful dictionary created by Samuel Johnson, but it was a sort of most miraculous creation in a very few years with the help of a very small group of amanuenses, and it became pretty clear to anybody who studied English, even at that date, that it was, there were huge gaps. It didn't cover the whole language by any means, and it wasn't just sort of odd marginal things. It were quite central things that were missing. And one of the things that showed it up was that there were some pretty bright lexicographers in America who were producing, Daniel Webster was the main one, and his dictionary had a lot of other things in it. And there was also a new sort of school of historical scholarship arising, especially in Germany. And there was Franz Passow in Germany had produced a Greek dictionary of Greek that was attempted to use to work on historical principles, to use evidence, not just to sort of illustrate the senses that were more or less kind of arbitrarily dictated, but they were actually based on usage. And this was taken up in German. This was taken up for the German language by the brothers Grimm, who are famous for their fairy tales, but they're actually primarily language scholars. So the idea of a dictionary which traced the history of words in a structured way and used actual evidence, actual quotations to show how usage had developed and changed, became something that in this country was there was a realization there was a need for it. There was a society called the Philological Society, which still exists. It flourishes, but in the early 19th century, it was very concerned about these enormous gaps in our knowledge of English, and it was very concerned to produce an overall complete picture of English, not just from the modern language, but historically. And so in 1857, there was a sort of committee got together and proposed that something should be done about this. And I mean, the story's been told in many places, so I won't sort of go into it in detail, but essentially they began to collect materials. People all over the country and indeed in other parts of the world responded to a kind of public call and sent in lots of examples of words. They divided up the English language into periods and asked for examples of usage from those periods. They worked out where there were gaps as well. They knew there were particular meanings and words that were missing, and they wanted examples of those. These were all sent in. And for about 20 years or so, it sort of moved along rather slowly. The very first editor who'd been on the committee actually died very soon after starting work. And then it was taken over by a rather eccentric man called Frederick Furnivall, who unfortunately had about 10 other irons in his fire and was doing all these different things at once. So it moved along slowly. And the great moment was when an agreement was drawn up between the Philological Society, Oxford University Press, and James Murray, who was a kind of independent scholar. I mean, he wasn't a university man at all. He was actually working in a bank. Sorry, he wasn't working in a bank then. He was a school teacher then. He had worked in the bank, but to really get the thing on going. So it was in a way a typical product of Victorian or at least 19th century scientific thought. The idea that the idea of evolution, the idea of development, the idea of creating a complete kind of scientific treatment of something. Murray even talked of himself as being a form of anthropologist, which is an interesting idea for lexicography. He saw it as an extension of, the study of human beings. So I think you can see our origins very much in the thought forms of that period.
So I suppose not only is it an attempt to describe or give a picture, a snapshot per se of what a language is at this present moment, but you would say the Oxford English Dictionary was also an attempt to document kind of the development
Yeah,
of the language over a
definitely.
long period of time. And I suppose under that paradigm, what would you suggest, or from your experience, what do you think is the main causes for the development of language?
The main cause.
Yes.
Uh,
Why do
uh,
words change, I suppose? Why, how do
well,
we get these different?
that is the fascinating. That is the fascinating question, and I mean, lexicographers tend to be very much focused on the word they're working on and don't tend to theorize, don't tend to sit back and theorize very much, tend to leave that to people in academia to think out, and we don't necessarily even keep up with what the scholars are, what their latest theories are. I think we notice some patterns, but I think to me it's still a kind of not fully explored or fully explained picture. One thing that's just very clear is that we like creating new words and new meanings. It's not always obvious where they come from, because obviously one of the things that we do on the OED is to try and trace the first use and the origin of things. And some things, of course, are individually crafted by someone, a poet, a journalist, a politician or something. You can say that phrase was thought of by that person and it got into general use. But I think that's pretty much a minority. It's a bit of a mystery where many words come from. I mean, of course, we've got a large stock of words which go back and back and back into history, and the etymologists, can trace them and relate them to other languages. But in the end, where do they come from? Nobody knows, because it's before, recorded, excuse me, before recorded, before the use of writing. But clearly new words do arise all the time. And although some are generated by known mechanisms of, compounding or derivation with affixes, suffixes, prefixes, and all that, an awful lot do pop up from somewhere else, we don't know where. So the mechanism for word creation isn't altogether clear. To some extent there is perhaps, echoing or onomatopoeia or whatever you want to call it, where you imitate a sound, but clearly that doesn't account for the majority. And then in terms of the change of meaning, which is particularly interesting to us, I think, there is a kind of tendency. There are various tendencies. I mean, there's obviously figurative use, the fact that concrete or concrete terms are used in an abstract way. So immediately that leads to a change of meaning. And of course, often the original concrete use disappears from view because, technology has removed whatever it was. The agricultural metaphor, the agricultural practice on which a metaphor is based is gone. There's also, there are various similar mechanisms, like using part of a thing to refer to the whole of a thing, or the whole of a thing to refer to a part of the thing, or, broadening, narrowing, all that kind of process. I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on, but it's all a bit generalized. I don't know what would be useful to say as a sort of overall statement, other than we know that language insists on changing and is not static. And there are a lot of, you can see patterns that occur all over the place. I mean, to take one rather specialized one, words that are used to mean, to refer to obligation, particularly verbs like must, let's say, very often change, and this doesn't just apply to English, it applies to other languages. They often change into words referring to probability. So you say, I must be at work tomorrow. but then you can also say the light's on in his room, so he must be at work, i.e., probability is that he is at work. And that change of application applies to quite a lot, well, several words in English, but also I understand that it also applies in other languages. So there's clearly a kind of psychological mechanism, fairly simple one, going on, whereby we sort of relate necessity or obligation to probability in this sort of way.
And we talked about how the Oxford English Dictionary was formed. How has that changed over time? How has the methodology in which the OED is being developed and written today, is it a very new methodology that you're using? Is it quite similar to how it was 100 years ago? And of course, have the aims changed as well?
Yes. Oh, we got a multiple question there, so I'll have to hold the aims bit. I think,
Yes.
in a sense, the methodology is the same and it's different, because what we're trying to do is, in one sense, the same. We're trying to amass evidence, and we're trying to make sure it's accurate, and we're then analyzing it and defining and describing and setting that all down in some sort of structured way. So when I joined, and this would have been true 100 years before, we worked with a pen and and slips of paper 6 inches by 4 inches, which were sent to the printer to be printed from, and that was the extent of technology. So you wrote, people wrote the examples, the quotations on slips. We collected the ones that were relevant to, related to each other, and we wrote a top slip. We wrote on the top blank slip what the word meant, and all the other material that you needed, the etymology, pronunciation, all the other things. In a sense, the dictionary is still arranged with that general schema in mind, but every medium has changed completely. Obviously, the final result is no longer not at the moment a printed book, but an online resource. And then all the procedures we use are obviously digitized. The editorial system is digital. The collection of evidence, although of course the original sources are often printed books and newspapers of the past, but they've pretty much all been digitized as well. So all the research and gathering of evidence, and indeed the checking, is most of it, or much of it, is again in digital form using online resources, and it means that whereas we were reliant, as I mentioned at the beginning, on people reading books or newspapers or whatever source and noting things down, although we still have a stock of things like that, and we still do have a reading program because it's efficient in some ways. Clearly, most of the research is done by searching different online resources, some of them very specialized, some of them, take one example, Early English Books Online, which gives us access to everything published between, the beginning of printing and 1700. Sorry, I've lost track of what I was saying, but so there's that kind of evidence, every kind of online resource, Google Books, you name it. And equally, in the old days, if we were looking for particular things which we couldn't find in our own library, we would have people stationed in other libraries, and we'd send them a message saying, look for this particular thing. Now, we actually do still have people working in libraries, not fewer, but obviously that whole process can be done, in a digital form. So just about every process has been transformed, and of course enabled us to feel much more confident about the fact that we've discovered not everything, obviously, about a word or its meaning, but we've done a much more thorough and comprehensive job, because, you know, in the past it was a bit of a hit or miss process.
That's quite fascinating. And I suppose now we could think about the aims and how the aims have developed over time. Do you think some of the fact of the improvement of technology has allowed for the aims of the Oxford English Dictionary to be a bit more ambitious? Has technology changed these aims?
Yes, I mean, in the very obvious sense, I think that in a way, the reason we all wanted to digitize the dictionary, and of course this applies to everything that's in digital form, the very fact that you can query your what can I call it, your corpus of material in other ways than simply looking up the head word to find out what the dictionary says about it. You can do searches across your collection of materials, whether you want to know, all the words that come from a particular language, or all the words that belong to a subject, or indeed compare other things. I mean, I don't think I need to specify that, because I think people are doing that all the time with online data. But we realized that it would be marvelous to be able to search the dictionary in other ways, and that's why we so much wanted to make this change. So clearly, yes, there are purposes which a paper dictionary in the past couldn't be used for, or it would be very difficult to use it for, which can now be carried out relatively easily. And I think that, I suppose we're going to touch on AI, aren't we? I think that AI is going to, it's going to, we don't fully know what it's going to do, but it's obviously going to sharpen that whole aim up even more, in ways we probably haven't yet worked out.
That's quite fascinating. And perhaps what do you think is, and we'll get to AI in a bit, but do you think, what do you think you would describe the core mission of the Oxford English Dictionary today? Would you say it's still documenting and tracing languages? And would that be the goal? Would it be to teach people more about the language? How would it be? How would it be best phrased?
Yes, I think the core purpose is still to have a complete, or as complete as possible, an inventory of the whole of our language, so that we know we've got a picture of pretty much, most of what's there, even though we know that it's constantly changing, and we know all the shortcomings of the idea of having a total picture. So I think that is still a very important purpose, without which other things can't be done. I think there may be educational uses, and I don't know whether they've been fully exploited yet, that perhaps nobody would have thought of using the OED for in the past. There've been quite a lot of work with schools, and indeed with people doing undergraduate courses to develop people's understanding of language using the resources of the OED. I think in the past it wouldn't have been regarded as necessarily the best. It would be a bit challenging for certainly for school students. Okay, undergraduates might well have been encouraged to use it, but I think the fact that it's so more easily accessible, and that there are types of investigation that you can now do that you couldn't do before, makes it quite an attractive tool for teaching. I think, again, it might be a resource that, it is a resource for research, for academic research in, probably in English language, but possibly in literature and other studies, maybe in historical studies, which again, I think is being used for, but I think is still under development. So I think I'm saying there are sort of not exactly secondary, but sort of extended uses that weren't necessarily so much envisaged at the beginning or when the OED was essentially print book, well, only a print book.
That's quite fascinating. And I suppose tying it a bit into the success of the Oxford English Dictionary, I remember my father once went to Oxford and he came back with an Oxford English Dictionary and he was like, I got an Oxford English Dictionary from Oxford. He was very happy with his purchase. I was wondering, what do you think made the Oxford English Dictionary such kind of a statement or a very important contribution to dictionaries in general, in contrast to its other competitors, not competitors in a kind of competition sense, but other dictionaries out there?
I think we were very lucky, and maybe I'm going to say we, before my time, really. I think we were partly lucky and partly, for whatever reason, very successful in carrying out this enterprise of creating a map of the English language. I'm thinking of the first edition of the OED, which completed in 1928. So in the first third of the 20th century, we were positioned there with this sort of complete picture. Other countries hadn't really done it in the same way. And of course, we were covering American, even if it wasn't as good as it could have been, but we were covering American historical usage in the way that something like Webster's wasn't doing. So what I'm saying is, there was the OED representing a very important world language, an increasingly important world language. It was a complete historical picture. And moreover, behind that, there was a family of dictionaries which were very widely used. I mean, they weren't the only, sort of shelf dictionaries of English that people bought, but they were very competitive, like the Concise and the Pocket and the Shorter, which for most of the 20th century were very common, very well known, very influential. And not to ignore, and this isn't really an offshoot of the OED, but we also had an important presence in the English language teaching, or the English as a second language, whatever you want to call it, field, starting really with the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, which actually was developed in Japan to begin with, but that had an immense influence in propagating the name of Oxford. So I think Oxford became, a name that was known throughout the world for lexicography and for language resources quite early on, even when well before the kind of digital revolution or anything like that. So I think we were, as I say, somewhat fortunate and somewhat successful by our own efforts in just sort of getting to that rather dominant position in the field. I mean, not completely dominant. I'm not saying that there weren't other players who were, also doing great work. But I think we had a great influence.
And you talked about the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, but you're quite influential and played a role in the second edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. Can you tell us a bit about the things which went into the creation of this second edition of the Oxford English Dictionary?
Yeah, the second edition, which obviously the thing that was a great experience for me personally and some of my older colleagues to work on. I mean, the origins of that were kind of sort of twofold. There was quite we're talking about the beginning of the 1980s, I should say. And just a quick background to that, during the previous 2 or 3 decades, Oxford had been producing a supplement to the main OED because it was realized that, the language didn't stand still in 1928. Lots of things happened, including in World War. And so after the World War II, it was decided that we must at least have a big supplement to the OED to cover all the language that hadn't been recorded there. And so that ended up being published as 4 volumes in the mid 1980s. So that's just a background thing. But OUP actually realized that the main OED, the original first edition, was going to be out of copyright and they were going to be in danger of pirating. So there was quite a sort of almost pedestrian reason for doing something about that. digitizing in some way, or doing something to produce a new. It wasn't digitizing wasn't the original thought. They just thought something must be done to produce a new edition which would protect the copyright. But there was also this growing awareness of, the potential of a digital resource. I don't think we used the word digital then. It was talked about computerization or something. And these two things came together. And we had some quite visionary people, I think, on our staff who said, look, if we actually digitize the whole OED and its supplement, which is just being completed, and we stick them together using software, which, we will have to develop, then we'll have a new edition, which will not only just protect copyright, but it'll be a new, a totally new book, which will be valuable, and we can publish it online. What publishing online meant sort of changed over time, because originally there was some idea that it would be, there was very rudimentary online access to databases, through modems and that kind of thing, but it was felt that was a possible route. Then along came the CD-ROM, and that was clearly a huge jump forward. Anyway, just that's going ahead of my story. So in 1983, we had to really invent the whole, the whole project was sort of done from scratch, because we had to find some company who had the capability to digitize the entire OED and supplement. And we found a brilliant group in America who were able to keyboard the whole thing, because it was found that any kind of scanning just wouldn't work. So they did that. We found we needed a computer system in order to do, the work. And of course, in those days, it meant a great big mainframe computer, because the capacity was so much less than it is today. And IBM, who were then big players in the field, donated us a computer and a staff to go with it, which was amazing. And the third player was the University of Waterloo in Canada, who were really excited about the whole idea of developing machine readable text. Didn't exist. We were so used to all text being machine readable that we forget, or it's easy not to remember what it felt like back in, those of us who were alive, in the early 80s, when basically texts were not machine readable, and it was just a kind of dream, really, to be able to do this. And so this all came together, and long story short, perhaps I should say, in 1989 we were able to publish the 20 volumes of the second edition on paper, and then a few years later to produce a CD-ROM, which at that time was regarded as almost miraculous, that you could have a small disc which had all that material on it and was searchable in ways no one had dreamt of before. So that was really in a nutshell, the story of OED2. I probably left out lots of important things, but that was the key developments, really.
What do you think was your biggest takeaways from being involved in that process of creating the second edition of the Oxford English Dictionary? Was it very much, I guess, an academic insight into how this works in a greater depth? Did you learn new things in regards to the philosophy of language, technology? What do you think were some of the big takeaways that you got from this process?
I think there were multiple lessons that all kinds of different people learned. I mean, the team at Waterloo who developed tools for searching the OED actually went on to spin off the things the engines, search engines they produced, into more generalized tools, and it all eventually fed into the kind of methods for searching that are now used on the web. I mean, XML came pretty much out of that. So we were, in a way, involved in the roots of web and the way that we all, use it today. So that's one dimension, and obviously that rubbed off on us at OUP, and that we clearly, had to stay involved in that whole scene. I think for us as lexicographers, in a slightly more sort of pedestrian way, we realized the massive challenge that faced us. One of the, there was a very basic challenge of seeing that your data, or trying to make your data consistent. It was pretty remarkable that the way the first edition of the OED had been designed purely in terms of typography and layout was consistent enough that it could be translated into a markup language, and hence into something that's like the predecessor of XML. But clearly there were lots and lots of inconsistencies, and we were challenged all the way along trying to convert our data into a better form. And that was a very useful lesson, because it's a great discipline in terms of putting your dictionary together to have a template, you might say, of structural elements which you've got to present your material in, rather than just kind of writing a loose, kind of loose essay on each word or each meaning. I think, gosh, there are so many takeaways. I mean, clearly, one of the things that happened very soon afterwards was the development of the internet. And at first we thought, great, this is a terrific opening for us and for the use of our product. And then, of course, we thought, this is going to enable people to research every kind of source that we would use, and we're going to have to be ahead of the game, or at least up with the game ourselves. We realized that we had an enormous task on our hands. We had to completely enlarge the scope of the revision process. We'd always intended to revise the OED once perhaps I've jumped over this stage. I should have made it clearer that right from the start, our sort of second aim after producing the second edition was to revise the whole OED, bring it up to date, make the definitions in much more contemporary terms, make sure that we, that the evidence cited was up to date, revise in all kinds of other ways. We knew we had that to do, but we suddenly realized that the task was going to be a great deal bigger, because resources that had been hidden away in libraries were suddenly going to be available to everybody, and we were going to have to make sure we were, searching all of them and drawing on all of them. Otherwise, people would be saying, "Oh, you've missed this example," or you haven't picked up this vital piece of information. So it greatly enlarged the scope of what we were going to do. I think we had a more modest aim to begin with. We just didn't. It became a different world. That's really, that's the short way of saying it. We moved from the old world of going to libraries, looking things up, finding interesting new leads and checking them, to suddenly everything is available to everybody, and we've got to really do a bigger job.
And there seems to be a lot of new words showing up in the world currently, at a rate that I don't think it was even the case 5 years ago, perhaps given the rise of social media and the fact that everyone's kind of scrolling through their phones, and the way trends work, someone comes up with the idea that it's all of a sudden everywhere. So I was wondering, how quickly and what does the process look like when a word gets discovered, per se, and then the Oxford English Dictionary says, well, okay, we want to add this word to the dictionary. What's the thought process which goes into that?
Yes, it's a difficult one, actually, because and I have to say, I'm not now much involved in work on new words and meanings, and I think it's a very challenging field, because I think our preference as historical lexicographers is always to stand back a bit and have at least, say, a decade to look back and say, well, did this word or this usage really gain a foothold, or is it something that flitted through and disappeared? But there's great pressure, of course, to be comprehensive and, to put it negatively, not to have people saying, you haven't covered X, Y, Z. And, it puts us on the defensive to say, well, we don't know that it's necessarily going to establish itself, And I think there is a lot that is ephemeral. I think there is a lot that doesn't establish itself. And clearly the OED cannot keep track of every very minute bit of usage that's, that because it just gets too granular. But deciding between, what's worth it and what's not worth it, it sounds like a terrible value judgment for a start. And then actually just making up your mind is very difficult. And there may be something that's relatively ephemeral at a particular period, recent period, but you think, well, culturally it was important, so we'll put it in. But then you think, in 100 years' time, assuming we're all still here, will it still seem culturally important? So, having a much longer timescale is much better in a way. It's a really quite a difficult. It's a difficult job. I think, in a way, the way that as you say, everybody is on the web. They're all, everybody's talking, everybody's writing, everybody's clicking. It means in a way that you could say there are other resources that can do this. There are other sort of online dictionaries or online, they may not be very formally done, but they're, people collect current usage and comment on it. And maybe that's fine. They can do that. And we can simply try to stand back a bit and collect up the things that really are, as you might say, worth saving, even though I know that sounds like an awful judgment. Because you can't hope to keep up with everything. We actually have a huge database of things, of items which we or outside correspondents send in to say, this is a potential entry or a potential sense in the dictionary, and it has thousands and thousands of items. We trawl through them. We try to triage them in various ways. I think there are quite sophisticated systems about which I know little because I'm not a member of the team that does it. But, you can get it wrong because the thing can appear to be not very important, then suddenly it springs into importance later. So everything is a moving picture. Nothing is a fixity, really, I think is the only thing you can say. I'm not sure that I answered your original question, actually, but
I think that gets the idea of it. I suppose it's quite difficult to judge or triage between those different words which come up. And even me, when I'm going through my social media accounts at times, I sometimes look at this and I'm like, I've never seen this before in my whole life.
Yes.
And it seems to have no trace anywhere. And lo and behold, as you suggest, 2 years later, or even less than that, later in the month, I've never seen that word used ever again, even though it was absolutely everywhere in that one period. And I guess some people might be interested in saying, well, okay, yes, it might not have stood the test of time, but it was very important at this particular year or that particular area, I guess, almost as a snapshot to say in 2025 January or 2025 itself, there was this one word which was very important, and then it just kind of disappeared. It came in and gone in the year. I mean, I wonder how that would that suggest that if the goal of the dictionary is to have that long view to document the rise and falls of different words and whatnot, would it be helpful to include, do you think, words even if they were only there for an ephemeral moment?
I think I think there's, the point is there's always going to be a lot of things left out. That is absolutely inevitable. For one thing, simply because we haven't got the resources and nobody would, to document them and to keep track of them. So there's always going to be that. And then then there's also the slightly more theoretical point that there is a distinction between some kind of more general usage and a more specific usage. And some things are just in the usage of a few people or a small group of people, or a fairly limited interest group who aren't necessarily part of the mainstream. And it seems reasonable not to feel you have a duty to document all that. It seems reasonable to think that there is some kind of broader platform of language. And I know that can sound like, well, we're creeping back to some kind of standard and some kind of prescriptivism. The fact that I'm groping a bit is indicative of how very, very difficult this whole issue is. And I don't think we will ever arrive at a sort of perfect theoretical model that says, oh yes, we know exactly what things belong in this category, and which things belong in the, in that kind of dictionary and so forth. I think that there's always a fluidity, and we're always going to get it slightly wrong at times. I think one can only say that we do know that, there's quite a lot of the language which is relatively stable, and that's probably the most important part to try to register. And just going back a step, actually, I think we didn't talk enough about the fact that what has changed is the fact that we're all, if I can use the word, we're all twittering, and I'm not with a capital T necessarily. We're all tweeting away to each other. We're all talking on the web in a way that was never the case before, because there was only either conversation between people that was never heard by anyone else, and print. There was sort of virtually nothing in between. Well, I suppose there were letters, but that was really just conversation on paper. And we've got this strange intermediate forum, which is neither the kind of the print medium that we all used before, where a few chosen people wrote things and the rest of us read them, and private conversation. We now got this strange arena where everybody's talking. I think that is a new picture, and I think perhaps even lexicography hasn't completely come to terms with it and decided what you do. But it is, of course, a really useful resource, and we do quote from social media to a certain extent, simply because it gives us nice examples of relatively natural, you have to be careful because, of course, it's not totally natural, but relatively natural usage, which you don't necessarily get in printed sources.
That's actually a dimension I didn't think about before, or at least it's quite good you raised it, because I suppose the meaning and intention behind the language almost is 90% or 80% of the value of the language itself. And if we don't really understand the context and intention behind tweeting in the same way that we perhaps would understand historically published books and conversation, that would raise interesting questions for how we conceive of the language and the words used in that context. Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I'll have to think about
you could imagine in not many years' time an AI that had been trained as a lexicographer, as it were, and it was let loose on a body of social media, whatever it was, a collection of X tweets over so many years or whatever, you can just imagine something. And it sat down, and didn't have to sit down, but it simply chewed its way through this and produced, as it were, a dictionary, because it had the necessary training in how to do it, and it was able to analyze what it saw. I'd be surprised if it was 100% accurate. I think they'd probably have some egregious mistakes in it, but it could be done. I'm sure. But of course it would have to keep going, because that language would keep changing as well. I'm just fantasizing, but I'm thinking, a little bit outside the box about what might be done in the future. I don't think it would make what we do redundant. And I mean, we might come on in a minute to where AI, figures in our scene at the moment, but you might want to get there later. I don't know.
That sounds quite fascinating, and it's good that you raised AI, because I think this is quite a good way to slowly wrap up this interview. And a final topic to think about is the role of technology, especially AI and dictionaries, going forward. You've given us a vision. I'm not sure whether it's a scary vision or a utopian vision. Sometimes I read novels about AI, and I never know whether they're positive or negative or how to read them. But how do you think the introduction of AI is going to change the future of dictionaries? And well, do you think that's going to have a very big impact on the Oxford English Dictionary?
It's all guesswork, and I'm not necessarily the best person to comment, but I can say that, well, first of all, at OUP in general, and in our language department in particular, AI is taken very seriously. We are not, we're not going to be sort of caught napping. We're going to keep track of it. On the other hand, we are quite cautious about the use of it, but we're experimenting widely. I mean, what we definitely think AI can do for us is sift an awful lot of information very quickly and serve it up to the lexicographer, who is the expert, to and therefore save him or her lots of time at that initial sifting stage, and so reserve his or her time for the expert bit, the bit that we don't think that AI can do yet, and we think it might never really be able to do. I don't know. I mean, that obviously one could discuss that, but let's sort of leave that on one side for the moment. So, for example, we need to do various things to a whole body of definitions in the dictionary that we haven't got round to a complete revision of, and we can instruct our AI tools to look for certain things, to look for certain types of definition or whatever it might be, to suggest along lines that we give them what could be done to modernize them, or to put them in terms that we now want them to be in, and then say, here they are, and hand them to us, and then we can then do work which would take us much longer if we had to do all those initial stages to revise or to revise and represent these parts of OED of dictionary entries. Sorry, I haven't put that very well, but in other words, it's treating AI as a bit of a menial slave at the moment, but we think they can definitely do that. We think it can definitely, do the initial stages, which would take us an awfully long time. I mean, we'd obviously in the past have used computing processes, but we would have to think out, each stage, and we'd have to produce long lists and things like that. AI can just probably do that very quickly for us. So at the moment, that's the main internal, as it were, use within the lexicographical process, the editorial process. The other way that we're, very keen to develop AI is the online user of the dictionary or other resources like it, in the past has had to work out their, I mean, this is true of the web in general. If they've got a query, they've got to sort of work out a way of putting it so as to find the information they want. Now, of course, you can say to Google, I don't know, any question you like, really, what color is Mars, and it will tell you straight away, just like that. It's got the built-in intelligence. Well, we want to be able to, I think, to have our users just ask the OED a question and not have to think out, how do I write an algorithm to do that? Just, tell me this thing, and have an AI component that will then work out what is wanted, do the relevant processing, and spew out an answer that, the reader can understand straight away. And I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a simple proposition, but I think that's what we're definitely working on, and that's probably applies to other resources that we publish as well. I wouldn't think it would just be limited to the OED. I think it would be quite general, but I mean, certainly in the OED, we're interested in doing that. So those are two areas: one, the internal production area, and the other, the external user area.
That's very fascinating, and thank you very much for coming onto the channel to discuss this these ideas, the Oxford English Dictionary, the philosophy of language, and where there's so much to be discussed and so much that I'm sure can be developed. So I'll be happy to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you have any questions and any ideas or any reflections, because I found this very interesting. Normally, I don't think much about the philosophy of language or even dictionaries in general, but this conversation has really made me think a lot about different ideas and ways in which language can indeed be explored. Thank you once again for coming onto the channel. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments below what else you want to see. Thank you very much again, and have a good one. God bless, and I'll see you next video.